mental intuition. It's one of my favorite types of intuition because I am. I'm all in my head. I am all in my head. And for many of us, we are all in our head. And this is where our mental intuition is. Now, if anyone tells you that they understand the brain, they're probably trying to sell you something. Even the greatest of neuroscientists will admit that they don't completely understand the brain. And that's because your brain in your head is just the most incredible thing ever. Now, I will just put my hands up. I am not a neuroscientist. I am a brain enthusiast. I think everyone should have one. And sometimes I think some people don't. But moving on really swiftly from my negativity, the brain, so let's just put it this way. Everything I'm about to teach, I think the best way to look at it is as if it's a metaphor, because I'm going to use a lot of metaphor within this because it's so complicated. I mean, even if I started to use all of the fancy words which make you sound really intelligent, like prefrontal cortex, oh yes, prefrontal cortex, let me say it again, you know, amygdala. Oh, you see, these words make me point my toes. I love all of this stuff. But like I say, I think it's easier to kind of like put it in a kind of like a layman's way of looking at things. I think we all understand it a bit better that way. Your intuition has to be received. You can't go out and get it. You can't go and go, right, I'm going to find my intuition. I'm going to rugby tackle it to the floor. I'm going to shake it until it coughs up its information. It needs to be received. Now, your brain is split into two. If any of you saw the Jill Bolte-Taylor My Stroke of Insight TED Talk, someone comes out onto the stage and gives her a brain. It's great. And I'm sure it helped her speech. And she's holding this brain in her hands. And then she kind of moved her fingers and it pretty much fell into two direct halves. And you will have seen pictures of the brain, and hopefully you haven't seen your own because you might not be able to tell me about it. So it really is split into two halves. However, what's exciting is if you were to damage, say, for example, an area of the right hemisphere of the brain, the left hemisphere of the brain would compensate for it. So we have neuroplasticity. So the brain can actually rewire itself. You know, I wish my circuit board could do that. It can actually rewire itself. So what I'm about to tell you is not a hard and fast kind of way of looking at it. Okay, so there's my disclaimer. So the left hemisphere of the brain is the brain that you took to school. It's your doing, your fixing, your sorting, your achieving, your compartmentalized thinking brain. It has words, it has language, it has a language center. And it's the brain that we got really rewarded at school for being in connection with. So we've got great rewards. If you like, oh, top of the class, oh, you've passed an exam, oh, congratulations. So we kind of left the right hemisphere of the brain behind a little bit. And yet it's what we started with. We started with our creative imagination, our creativity, our fun, our receiving of imagination and ideas. And as we move forward, I think that right hemisphere thinkers are going to change the world. No pressure, just saying. Because the right hemisphere of the brain is your receiving part of the brain. It doesn't have a language center, but it receives, it sees patterns in things, it's aware of color, and it's kind of your creativity. It's the home of your imagination. And what ends up happening is we don't credit it as much because we don't think that it can earn us as much money. But hang on a minute, isn't everything that you're looking at in the room, hasn't all of that come from somebody's imagination? You know, so I'm at the moment staring into an Apple computer, you telling me that you can't make any money from your right hemisphere of your brain. Of course you can. But it's also the home of your intuition. It's where your intuition sparks. And later on in the course, we're going to be talking about your gut brain and your heart brain. And it's all connected by a thing called the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerves run throughout your body. And I believe the vagus nerve is how our intuition really kind of like carries itself through on our internal side. And we'll talk about our energetic body at another point in time again on the course. So just stay tuned. So your right hemisphere of the brain is how we receive information. So when I say you can't go out and get intuition, it's the right hemisphere of the brain that receives it. Now, the right hemisphere of the brain also goes more online as we're falling asleep. So there's actually a crossover point. We talked a little bit about this at 5:30 yesterday when we were in our catch-up class, that the part of our brain when we're going to sleep, it kind of goes from being well, let's call it masculine, actually, the left hemisphere. That's quite often perceived as being masculine, and that's not got really anything to do with it being male or female, but more kind of the sort of idea of the masculine being doing, fixing, sorting, and achieving, and the feminine being receiving. And there's obvious reasons for that. If you don't want me to go too graphically into what I'm talking about, just saying. So I did a little weird gesture with my hands then. Moving on. So when you have been doing, fixing, sorting and achieving around about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you switch to the passive stillness and being, where we emotionally kind of process everything that happened in our doing, fixing, sorting time. And it's at that point where sensible cultures have a little siesta. And I highly recommend an afternoon nap. Afternoon naps are really great for your intuition, because when we're going into the right hemisphere of the brain, and when we're being more right hemisphere, you could be struggling with a question all day, and then you have a little nap kind of at about 4 o'clock, and eureka, your intuition has kind of stepped in, or even your imagination has stepped in, and it has played its part in the right hemisphere of the brain, and you wake up with this really amazing idea. This also is why people recommend meditation when it comes to intuition. Because meditation, if done well and correctly, is a way of quietening, if not turning it off completely, the voice in our head, which is the left hemisphere of the brain. So it allows the right hemisphere of the brain to deliver the knowledge that it has received. So this is why the stillness, the passive, really helps. I can also recommend swimming, because for me, water is predominantly female. You know, water receives you, doesn't it, as you go and swim, you know. And so swimming to me allows my right hemisphere of the brain to become more open. And especially if you think about breath work and how we breathe, you know, when you're swimming, breath is everything. But, well, clearly, especially if you're under the water, but breath is everything when you're swimming. So when we're looking at things that actually activate the right hemisphere of the brain to give you the knowledge it has been receiving from the intuition, running, because that's about breath. And if you think about it, it's like shamanic bang, 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 you know, the beat of a drum. And drumming also is a really good way, because your hands are doing something that the left hemisphere is telling it to do. Your somatic intuition is doing it because it remembers the beat and you don't really have to think about it. So it's kind of turned off the left hemisphere of the brain, and your right hemisphere of the brain is expanding. This is why shamans have kind of like gone into drumming. And in order to do a form of journeying, which again allows our right hemisphere of the brain to, through metaphor and pictures and imagination and links to things and patterns and even, you know, kind of math related things, kind of allows the patterns of the universe of maths to kind of like come through. Sounds all a bit fascinatingly wanky at the same time. So anything like running, dancing, swimming, you know, maybe even riding your bike, anything that also gives you an open vista, which is why when we go to the sea, we can go, oh, I'm at one with the universe, because the sea gives you that open vista. And any of you who've got dogs calm right down when you give them an open vista. So this is why we want dogs to be in fields and open spaces and in parks and by the beach, because that open vista allows the right hemisphere of the brain to stop taking on board so much information, and the right hemisphere of the brain to actually be able to release the information that it's got. I mean, it is crazy the amount of information that we're picking up all of the time, and our brain just can't fathom it all out. So I think it's only 9% of the information that we actually pick up that we actually process into actually being anything. And I think that that's more the left hemisphere stuff than the right hemisphere. And also in that TED talk, My Stroke of Insight, she also, it's the left hemisphere of the brain had a brain bleed, and she was a neuroscientist. So she could see how much her right hemisphere was online. So it's a really good TED talk if you get to have the opportunity to see it, about how the difference of the right and the left hemisphere of the brain works. She describes getting on the phone, trying to make a phone call, and in trying to make a phone call, she had to match the shapes of the numbers because, again, that language center wasn't quite working. Now, if you think about this, and we haven't discussed this because the word intuition is kind of, we kind of all get it, you know. I mean, Steve Jobs talked about it, Richard Branson talks about it. But if you think about the stereotype of a psychic, for example, which of course is to have some kind of paranormal level of intuition, which I don't really believe in actually. I just believe that they have a brain ability, and you have that too. So if you can actually go less into the left hemisphere of the brain and allow the right hemisphere of the brain to get more in control, then you could do absolutely everything a psychic can do. And I said yesterday about future predictions, I don't believe in them. I believe someone tells you something's going to happen, then you manifest it, you just make it happen. So what that is, if you look at the stereotype of a psychic, you know, crushed velvet, usually dyed pink, purple, kind of green, maybe even hair, hooped earrings, headscarf, I don't know, bangles, but they are colourful looking. They've got this kind of like idea of them. And there was a television show in the UK called Test the Nation, and they got loads of different people, like from doctors, dustbin men, neuroscientists, and one time they had psychics. And even Anne Robinson, who is one of the most scathing of television presenters, couldn't find anything funny to say about the psychics because they bombed. They absolutely did a terrible job because the questions were left hemisphere of the brain, not right hemisphere, and their skills are in the right hemisphere, not in the left. Now, if we split this up into kind of thinking about dyslexia is a more right hemisphere skills. So there's more skills in the right hemisphere of the brain for people who are dyslexic as opposed to the left. If you're autistic, you're more likely to be more left hemisphere of the brain than right. So you're more likely to remember names, numbers, but not be particularly good with eye contact, but you'll remember dates of things that people have long forgotten. So I'm not saying, because let's face it, you can be autistic and dyslexic at the same time. So I'm not saying it's one skill or another, but I'm just using this as a way of understanding that actually when someone has a brain ability, we call them a fake. That's weird. When someone has a brain disability, we create a charity. And yet we're more focused on people's disabilities than their abilities, which is really annoying, especially if you've got a disability. Unless you like attention, then you get loads of attention, but it's not necessarily helpful because we're not empowering people into what they can do. We're focused on what they can't do. And I think there would be a heck of a lot more geniuses out there in the world if we actually focus on what people can do instead of kind of going, well, you don't fit into the world normally, so we need to find ways to help you fit in normally. Instead of saying, what can you teach us as normal, boring people? So when we think about the language centre, we quite often get confused with the idea that the thoughts in our head are who we are, that they are our personality. But the thoughts in our head are kind of almost like self-protecting and self-understanding programs. So if you look at this as being things, when we had the theta brainwave, which is up until about the age of 7, your brain acted like a sponge. It just picked things up. And also at that time, you were more right hemisphere than left hemisphere. So we didn't really have the opportunity to discern things into kind of rational, sort of logical thought. So we felt our way through life an awful lot more. We'd absorb information, see how it felt, and use it through the filter of feelings. And so in order to be able to protect ourselves if something bad was happening to us, we created characters. So if you think, when you feel your way through something, the easiest way to process and understand something is through story. So in a way, we created ourselves as characters within our own story. And at the point in time that we were doing this, we were a child. So the first leading character in our archetypes or our subpersonalities was that of the inner child. And then everything we created beyond that was to keep us safe. So subpersonalities or archetypes, the inner critic, the saboteur, all of those people are actually protectors. They're all trying to protect us from things that we felt we needed protecting from as a child. And as a child, because you've got the theta brainwave, you don't think, I've got really inept parents, or that teacher's a bully. You think there's something wrong with me and I need to fix it. So that might mean we adopt the voice of the critic, which might be a teacher at school or one of your parents. We adopt the voice of the saboteur, which might be, don't raise your head above the parapet because someone will cut it off. So we tend to kind of like look at how we can stay protected. So the saboteur might say, you did really well in class and the kids started bullying you. We're never going to do well again because that sucked. And then you've created a glass ceiling for yourself. So, and I could talk about this for years. I absolutely am fascinated by the voices in our head, mainly because I'm chatty and I have quite a lot of voices in my head, but I'm also highly intuitive. So I can move from the thinker of the thoughts into the right hemisphere of the brain. And how I do that is, and how you can do it too, is that when you are in your chatty part of the brain, you can be aware of your thoughts because you are actually the real you. The you is the thinker of your thoughts. So I'll give you an example of this. Is a client came to see me and he was saying to me, I've come to see you because I really suffer from a profound lack of self-confidence. And I said, well, really? And he went, well, yeah, really. And I went, are you sure? He said, well, of course I'm sure. I wouldn't have booked an appointment with you if I wasn't sure. I said, oh, I said, well, you don't strike me as being unconfident. I can tell you I'm really unconfident. And he defended it with the valor of a knight. So what was he doing? How could an unconfident person come in and with the valor of a knight tell me that he was unconfident? Because he was talking about somebody else. That somebody else still is him. It's an aspect of him. It's a part of him that exists within his head and within his psyche, but it's one of his protectors. And one of his protectors says, if I am unconfident, then people will give me attention, they'll love me and like me, because every single one of our limiting beliefs has a positive benefit. Otherwise, we'd have got rid of it years ago. Come on, we're not stupid. That's one of my limiting beliefs, just right there. Stupid. So we can get to a point where we kind of like look at all of this and kind of like go, so then if I'm the person who is talking about the person who is vulnerable, who am I looking at? And there's a proverb, and it's probably an American Indian proverb, aren't they always American Indian? It's not like somebody from Essex ever seems to come up with amazing proverb. Nothing wrong with Essex, however, it's just we don't value proverbs from Essex, and maybe we should. So the American Indian proverb, two wolves, one is the wolf of your insecurity, your fear, your weakness, your blah, and the other wolf is the wolf of your compassion, your love, your valor, your courage. American Indian sage, which wolf is going to win in the fight in my brain? Well, the wolf that you feed. And what do we mean by feeding the wolf? Well, feeding the wolf is about giving it the thoughts, it's about giving it attention, it's about giving it energy, it's about giving it your awareness. So what is the awareness? So there's your thoughts chattering away. And then when you take a step back, you realize that you're the thinker of the thoughts, and the thinker of the thoughts is your awareness. Now, if you're still going, okay, if you've ever been rip-roaringly drunk, and I mean slurring your words, hanging onto the wall, thinking you're going to be sick, falling out of a taxi, drunk, right? That kind of drunk, really drunk, like pickled drunk, like, I mean, hangover that could last for days, that drunk. Is your awareness of being drunk or sober? I would put to you that it's sober. The awareness of being drunk is sober. Now, for those of you who are lucky enough to have never experienced a hangover in the whole of your life, I'll put this to you. Have you ever been so angry? I mean, you're having an argument with someone and you're so angry and you know that there is one thing that you could say that will completely win you that argument, but lose you the relationship. And you don't say it. Why don't you say it? Because the awareness is calm. So the awareness is something that is without language. We can translate its language, and it might say, oh, don't throw up in the flower pot, that's a really bad idea, get yourself into the bathroom. But it doesn't come like that. It comes like a knowing. And this is why I called my book You Do Know, because it comes as a knowing. There's a knowing that comes with it. And in that knowing, we're kind of like, I do know, I know. But when we're wrapped in the thoughts and the decision making, we don't know, because we're trying to figure it out. We're trying to use discernment, we're trying to use logic, because we're looking for what you might call the right thing to do. And actually, there is no right thing to do. I'm sorry about that. I'm going to bust this one right open. There is no difference between right and wrong. You know, I mean, obviously, don't kill anyone, don't do that. But there's no difference between right and wrong. It's all a level of perception. So your awareness may say, you know, via intuition, you know, so your awareness might go, oh, I have this surge forward, this really great feeling about something I want to do. And your logic will go, well, that doesn't make any sense. So when I moved to San Francisco, everybody said to me, doesn't make any sense. You know, you're really successful, you're doing really well, you own your own property, you don't want to sell in London, that's your pension money. I mean, they were right, actually, I have to be honest. But I knew I needed to move to San Francisco. And people said, why? And I said, I don't know why, I just know. And having that level of, I don't know why, I just know, feels like living at altitude. It's scary. It's so terrifying because we want to have surety, and that's the biggest block to intuition, because you'll suddenly go, I need to be sure. I can't just go on the knowing. I can't just go like that. But your awareness knows. So if you imagine that your awareness has a view that you can't see from being in, you know, the passenger seat of your life. So when you're in the driving seat of your life, it can see your fuel gauge, it can see like the direction, it can see the signposts, it can see how hot the engine is. And so when we meditate or run, or as we're falling asleep, we allow ourselves to go into the right hemisphere of the brain, which is really, really useful. So you have these different levels. You have the thoughts, the thinker of the thoughts, which is the awareness. And then I'd kind of go that there's one beyond that as well. There's many levels beyond that as well. So it's the thoughts, the observer of the thoughts, and then there's something else on the other side of that, which is kind of like the watcher. So there's the thoughts, the awareness of the thoughts, and then kind of like beyond the awareness of the thoughts, there's just this sense, this being, this stillness, this calmness. And when you start to feel it, it just feels like watching yourself with the eyes of God, no matter what that means to you. It's like watching yourself with the eyes of something that is divinely loving and a real sort of sense of presence. And so as we're kind of like looking at our different levels, and we'll go into this in the collective consciousness, I'll talk about that more. But for today, all I want you to do, it's quite an easy one today, she says. So what I really want you to do today is spend some time being conscious of your thoughts, being conscious of what the quality of the thoughts, what thoughts are kind of like digging in, kind of, you know, so are you aware when a thought is coming from a critic place? Are you aware when a thought is coming from a loving place? You know, I mean, and even those two things, is this a loving thought? Is this a critical thought? So even being aware of that, and then become aware of the awareness itself, so that you are going to become the observer of the observer. So this is loving presence. So you're going to be the observer of the observer. You are going to observe yourself observing the thoughts in your head. Don't get too tangled. We talk a lot about mental health, and you know, I really think that it stems from the thinker of the thoughts. And the minute we set a belief in motion, then that's when we start to struggle. So what I mean by that is you may be having really self-critical or harmful thoughts towards yourself, really self-critical thoughts. then we start believing in the thoughts and analysing the thoughts and trying to fix the thoughts. And then when we start analysing and trying to fix the thoughts and work out where the thoughts come from, and I'm not saying that therapy is therapy is a good thing to do. I wouldn't do what I do if it wasn't. But we can end up with what I would call an addiction to self. So an addiction to the thoughts that we're having, and an addiction to the problem. It's a little bit about like being unhappy about being unhappy. It's twice the amount of unhappiness. Nobody needs it. But if you can be happy about being unhappy, because I mean, you're really intelligent. If you're not unhappy from some time, at some time, you're not listening. That's called cloud cuckoo land. You don't want to live there. So being happy about the fact that you're deep enough to become unhappy, that you are deep enough to be depressed, that you are intelligent enough to feel all of the feels. You can be happy about that. And then it kind of stops the addiction to self. Because when we start to have this idea, this almost like an entitlement of believing that things should just be always all right for us. And I like the book, The Road Less Traveled by Scott Peck. And he talks about the very opening bit, which I read when I was 19, is life is difficult. And when we actually start to realize that, life gets a little bit easier. And I was like, yes, oh my gosh, that's right. Because as a teenager, I was completely consumed with what should be happening for me because I'm a nice person. And when we kind of release all of that, in other words, we go into the awareness and we become aware of our thoughts, we can feel into the thoughts with the right hemisphere of the brain rather than existing purely in the left hemisphere of the brain. We can step into the right hemisphere of the brain, the seat of our ideas, our imagination, our creativity, and find answers to the things that's making us unhappy. Find answers, because most depression, most feelings of unhappiness come from a lack of connection, something wrong with our environment, our work environment, or things like that, or something that's going out of kilt in your body and your hormones and things that's going on that way. So in essence, this gives you the opportunity to step back, to witness your thoughts, and to allow your intuition to become, in a sense, like your own internal psychotherapist, your own internal psychologist. Your awareness goes, you're doing that, you're thinking that because of that. And then you go, yes, now I can do something about that, or I can have compassion for that, or I can have acceptance for that. And then we take away some of that toxicity of overthinking the thing you think, thinking the thing about the thing that you were thinking. It's a lot of thinking, which actually leads to an addiction to self. And over time, we can have, say, for example, I like using anxiety as a great example. We can feel anxious about doing an exam, or anxious about something that's completely, COVID. It's a completely legitimate thing to be anxious about, completely legitimate. But when you start to worry about the anxiety, you start to describe yourself or think about yourself as being an anxious person, then the minute you label yourself as being anxious, then it becomes part of your personality. And you focus on the anxious thoughts in your head rather than the other thoughts that are also there. And then you suddenly go, oh, I'm an anxious person, I've got anxiety, I have anxiety, as if it was some kind of disease. And chronic anxiety is like a panic alarm being stuck on all the time. So it can get to this point. And then before you know it, you've got this kind of character, an anxious character, when that wasn't who you were in the first place. And you might recognize this, that when we live in a street, we'll go, oh yeah, Mrs. Such and Such at number 44, who's always anxious and uptight and in the street having a go at people and trying to control the street or whatever. You might get sad old Mr. What's his face at number 12, or that she's got OCD and always moves her car. You've got all of these different characters, but it's simply because they didn't get the opportunity to become aware of what was going on for them through their thoughts. So this is a big thing. So getting into the awareness helps your intuition be able to become your inner therapists. Good. Okay, so I'm going slightly over, I'm aware of that, and I know that we've got important places to be, and I've got some editing to do. I will put this up onto my Instagram. Please DM me on Instagram if you've got any questions from today, and also join me back here on Clubhouse at 5:30, and at 5:30 I'll be open to Q&A, further learnings based on your questions, and yeah, any thoughts that you've got and reflections on what you experienced today. So that would be lovely. See you at 5:30.